They mocked her for learning Apache words. But the warriors said, "She speaks with her heart." The sound of mockery. The dusty streets of Willow Creek stretched under the merciless Texas sun, where the heat seemed to press down on everything like a heavy hand. Clara Martinez wiped the sweat from her brow as she stepped out of the general store, her worn boots clicking against the wooden planks of the boardwalk. The year was 1884, and this small frontier town carried the weight of old prejudices like dust that never quite settled. In her calloused hands she clutched a piece of paper covered in her careful handwriting, Apache words she'd been trying to learn. The script looked foreign against the familiar English she'd known all her life, but something about these words called to her heart in a way she couldn't explain. "Clara, what in tarnation are you doing with that gibberish?" The harsh voice belonged to Samuel Hutchins, the town's self-appointed moral authority. His weathered face twisted in disgust as he pointed at her notes. "You're wasting your time with savage talk." A small crowd began to gather, drawn by the commotion like moths to flame. Clara felt her cheeks burn, but not from the sun. Mrs. Henderson, the preacher's wife, shook her head disapprovingly. "It's unseemly for a Christian woman to dabble in heathen languages," she declared, her voice carrying the authority of someone who believed God spoke exclusively through her. "Why would you want to learn their words anyway?" asked Tom Bradley, the blacksmith, his massive arms crossed over his chest. "They're the enemy, Clara. Your own father fought them not 20 years ago." Clara's grip tightened on her paper. Her father had indeed fought in the Apache Wars, but he'd also taught her something these people seemed to have forgotten, that understanding someone didn't make you a traitor. "Knowledge isn't the enemy," she said quietly, her voice barely audible above the murmur of disapproval. "Knowledge?" Samuel scoffed. "That's not knowledge, girl. That's foolishness. You're embarrassing yourself in this whole town." The crowd's laughter felt like needles against her skin. Clara had always been different, the daughter of a Mexican mother and an Irish father. She'd grown up caught between worlds. But this felt different. This felt like betrayal, not just of her but of something larger than herself. As the jeers grew louder, Clara noticed a figure standing in the shadow of the saloon across the street. He was tall, with long black hair and clothes that marked him as Apache, leather and cloth that spoke of a different way of life. Most people in Willow Creek would have crossed the street to avoid him, but something about his stillness commanded attention. Their eyes met across the dusty road, and Clara saw something unexpected in his dark gaze. Not hostility, but curiosity. He'd been listening, she realized. He'd heard every word of the mockery, every laugh at her expense. "You see?" Samuel noticed her distraction and pointed across the street. "Even they're laughing at you, Clara. Give up this nonsense before you make a bigger fool of yourself." But the Apache man wasn't laughing. His expression was unreadable, but Clara could sense something deeper in his silence. A recognition, perhaps, or understanding. As the crowd began to disperse, still chuckling at her expense, Clara folded her paper carefully and slipped it into her pocket. She had work to do. The weight of words. 3 weeks had passed since the incident in the town square, but Clara's determination had only grown stronger. Every morning before dawn, she would sit by her small window, practicing the Apache words she'd collected from various sources, a traveling trader, old military reports, and even a sympathetic librarian in the county seat who'd found her an old linguistic study. The words felt clumsy in her mouth at first, like stones she couldn't quite smooth with her tongue. But gradually they began to take shape, to feel less foreign and more like bridges waiting to be built. Clara worked as a seamstress, her skilled hands crafting clothes for the women of Willow Creek. The irony wasn't lost on her. The same women who mocked her learning Apache words trusted her with their most intimate garments, their wedding dresses, their children's clothes. She sat in her small shop, listening to their gossip while her needle moved in steady, practiced strokes. "I heard she's been seen talking to herself in that savage tongue," whispered Mrs. Peterson, a rancher's wife who'd come for alterations on her Sunday dress. "Poor thing's probably lost her mind." "It's what happens when you don't have a proper husband to keep you in line," added Mrs. Henderson, her voice dripping with false sympathy. "A woman needs direction or she goes wandering down dark paths." Clara's needle paused for just a moment, then resumed its rhythm. She'd learned to let their words wash over her like rain off a roof. But sometimes, late at night, the loneliness would creep in, and she'd wonder if she was indeed losing her mind. The Apache man had returned to town several times since that first encounter. She'd learned his name was Nalnish, which meant he works in Apache. He came to trade, bringing beautifully crafted items that the white settlers grudgingly purchased despite their prejudices. His work was too fine, too valuable to refuse, even if they wouldn't acknowledge the skill behind it. Clara had begun to notice patterns in his visits. He always arrived on Thursdays, always stayed near the trading post, and always seemed to be watching, listening. Once, when she was walking to the general store, She'd seen him examining some of the white settlers' poorly made goods with what she could only describe as patient amusement. On this particular Thursday, Clara had decided to do something that terrified and thrilled her in equal measure. She'd been practicing one specific phrase for weeks, rolling it around in her mouth until it felt natural. As she walked past the trading post where Nalnish was examining a leather saddle, she took a deep breath and spoke. Gosh, she said, the Apache word for hello, sounding strange in the dusty air of Willow Creek. Nalnish looked up, his dark eyes meeting hers with surprise. For a moment neither of them moved. Then, slowly, he nodded. Goshki, he replied, his voice carrying the weight of generations who had spoken those syllables. The simple exchange lasted only seconds, but Clara felt as though she'd crossed an invisible bridge. As she continued walking, she heard Samuel Hutchins' voice behind her, sharp with disapproval. Did you see that? She's actually talking to him now. This has gone too far. But Clara didn't turn back. For the first time in weeks, she felt like she was walking in the right direction. The language of understanding. The seasons began to change in Willow Creek, bringing with them a subtle shift in the air that spoke of autumn's approach. Clara had been learning Apache words for 3 months now, and while her pronunciation was still uncertain, her dedication never wavered. She'd created a small notebook, filled with words and phrases, their meanings carefully annotated in her neat handwriting. The hostility from the townspeople had intensified rather than faded. Samuel Hutchins had begun organizing what he called concerned citizens, a group of men who believed Clara's actions were not just foolish, but dangerous. They met at the saloon on Tuesday nights, their voices growing louder with each round of whiskey, talking about the Apache sympathizer who was bringing shame to their community. It's not natural, declared Pete Morrison, a cattle rancher whose land bordered Apache territory. A woman learning their tongue, making friendly with them. Next thing you know, she'll be telling them our business, our weaknesses. She's already talking to that warrior, added Tom Bradley, his blacksmith's hands curled into fists. Who knows what she's telling him? What Clara was actually telling Nalnish were simple things. Greetings, comments about the weather, questions about words she couldn't quite pronounce. Their conversations, when they happened, were brief and careful, but they were real, and they were growing. Nalnish had begun to correct her pronunciation gently, his patience seemingly endless. When she struggled with the complex tonal aspects of Apache speech, he would repeat words slowly, letting her hear the subtle differences that changed meaning. His English was limited but functional, learned from years of trading with white settlers. Your tongue, it tries hard, he said one Thursday afternoon as they stood by the water trough outside the trading post. Clara had been attempting to say thank you in Apache, but the sounds kept slipping away from her like water through fingers. Ah-hey-he, he said slowly, breaking the word into syllables. Ah-hey-he, like wind through leaves. Clara tried again, and this time something clicked. Ah-hey-hey, she repeated, and saw the slight smile that crossed his weathered face. Better, he said. You listen with more than ears. That simple phrase stayed with Clara long after Nalnish had left town. She understood that he was talking about more than just language. He was talking about the quality of attention, the willingness to hear not just sounds but meaning, not just words but the heart behind them. The women of Willow Creek had begun to whisper that Clara was touched, that her obsession with Apache words was a sign of mental instability. Some suggested she needed to be sent away, perhaps to live with relatives in a more civilized place where she could be properly supervised. But Clara had found something in those words that the townspeople couldn't understand. Each Apache word she learned felt like a key to a door she hadn't even known existed. The language carried within it a different way of seeing the world, one that emphasized relationship, connection, and respect for the natural world in ways that English simply didn't capture. She began to see how the Apache language reflected a culture that viewed humans as part of nature rather than separate from it, how it contained concepts of time and space that were more fluid, more connected. The more she learned, the more she realized how much she didn't know, not just about the language but about the people who spoke it. One evening as Clara sat by her window practicing words by lamplight, she heard voices in the street below. Samuel Hutchins was leading a group of men past her shop, their footsteps heavy with purpose. Something's got to be done, she heard him say. This foolishness has gone on long enough. She's becoming a problem for this whole town. Clara blew out her lamp and sat in the darkness, listening to their voices fade into the night. She understood that her journey with the Apache language was becoming more than just personal learning. It was becoming a test of who she was and what she was willing to stand for. In the darkness, she whispered the Apache words she'd been practicing, letting them fill the silence with their ancient rhythms. Tomorrow, she decided, she would continue learning, not despite the opposition, but because of it. The Heart's translation. Winter had settled over Willow Creek like a gray blanket, bringing with it a harsh beauty that made the desert landscape look both desolate and magnificent. Clara had been learning Apache for 6 months now, and her small notebook had grown into 3 volumes filled with words, phrases, and cultural observations that fascinated her more with each passing day. The confrontation she'd been dreading finally came on a cold Thursday in December. Clara was walking to the general store when she found Samuel Hutchins waiting for her in the middle of the street, flanked by 5 other men, including Tom Bradley and Pete Morrison. Their faces were grim with the kind of righteous anger that brooked no argument. "Clara Martinez," Samuel called out, his voice carrying across the empty street. "This nonsense ends today." Clara stopped walking, her heart hammering against her ribs. She'd known this moment would come, but she'd hoped to have more time to prepare. Around them, curious faces appeared in windows and doorways, drawn by the drama unfolding in their quiet town. "I don't know what you mean, Samuel," Clara said, though they both knew she was lying. "You know exactly what I mean," he replied, stepping closer. "This Apache business, this fraternizing with the enemy, you're going to stop it now, or we're going to make you stop it." The threat hung in the air like smoke from a gun. Clara felt the weight of the entire town's attention pressing down on her shoulders. She could end this now, she realized. She could apologize, throw away her notebooks, and return to the safe, quiet life of a seamstress who kept her head down and her thoughts to herself. Instead, she found herself saying, "Learning someone's language isn't fraternizing, Samuel. It's trying to understand." "Understand what?" Pete Morrison spat. "How to help them raid our ranches, how to betray your own people. They're not the enemy," Clara said, her voice growing stronger. "They're just people trying to live their lives, same as us." The crowd murmured disapprovingly, but Clara continued. "I've been learning Apache words for months now, and you know what I've discovered? They have words for things we don't even think about. They have 17 different ways to describe the wind, each one capturing something different about how it moves through the world. They have words for the way morning light touches the mountains, for the particular silence that comes after rain. Pretty words don't stop bullets," Tom Bradley said harshly. "No," Clara agreed, "but understanding might prevent the need for bullets in the first place." Samuel's face had turned red with frustration. "You're a fool, Clara, a dangerous fool. If you don't stop this Apache nonsense, you'll find yourself very unwelcome in this town." As if summoned by the tension, Nalnish appeared at the edge of the crowd. He'd been coming to town regularly, and Clara had learned that he was something of a diplomat among his people, a man who understood both worlds and tried to build bridges between them. His presence now, silent and watchful, added another layer of complexity to the confrontation. "There's your savage friend now," Samuel sneered. "Why don't you go talk to him in his heathen tongue? See if he'll defend you when things get difficult." Clara looked at Nalnish, seeing the careful neutrality in his expression. She knew he wouldn't interfere. This was her fight, her choice to make, but something in his eyes gave her strength. "You want to hear me speak Apache?" Clara asked, her voice carrying clearly across the street. "Fine." She turned to face Nalnish and spoke carefully, using words she'd been practicing for weeks. "Haguni ba nsekizgo yinishe." The phrase meant, "I am trying to learn about peace." The crowd fell silent, shocked by the strange sounds coming from Clara's mouth. But Nalnish's expression changed, surprise and something deeper flickering across his weathered features. He replied in Apache, his voice carrying the musical quality that Clara had been trying to master. "Ba nsekizgo yinishe no we." Then, in English for the crowd's benefit, he added, "She learns with good heart." Samuel sputtered with rage. You see what she's become? She's chosen them over us." But Clara shook her head. "I haven't chosen anyone over anyone, Samuel. I've chosen understanding over ignorance. I've chosen to see people as people, not as enemies." The confrontation might have escalated further, but at that moment, Mrs. Henderson's young son came running down the street, tears streaming down his face. "Mama! Mama!" he cried. "Tommy fell down the old mine shaft. He's hurt bad." The crowd's attention immediately shifted from Clara to the emergency. Tommy Henderson was only 8 years old, and the abandoned mine shaft outside town was notoriously dangerous. As the men began organizing a rescue party, Clara noticed Nalnish step forward. "I help," he said simply. "I know mines." Samuel started to object, but Mrs. Henderson, despite her earlier criticism of Clara, grabbed Nalnish's arm. "Please," she said, "if you can help my boy." As the rescue party formed, Clara found herself walking beside Nalnish toward the edge of town. The confrontation had been interrupted, but not resolved. She knew that when they returned, she would still face the choice between conformity and truth. But for now, there was a child to save, and language barriers seemed suddenly less important than the universal desire to help someone in need. When words become actions, the abandoned mine shaft lay at the edge of Willow Creek's boundaries, a remnant from the town's brief flirtation with silver mining a decade earlier. The rescue party that gathered there included most of the town's able-bodied men, along with Clara, Mrs. Henderson, and Nalnish. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the rocky terrain, and the wind carried the sound of young Tommy's frightened cries from somewhere deep in the earth. "Tommy!" Mrs. Henderson called down the shaft. "Can you hear me, baby?" A weak voice echoed back. "Mama, my leg hurts real bad." Samuel Hutchins had taken charge of the rescue effort, his earlier anger at Clara temporarily set aside in the face of a child's peril. "We need ropes," he directed, "and someone small enough to get down there. That shaft's mighty narrow." The men looked at each other uncertainly. Most of them were too large to navigate the cramped space, and those who were small enough lacked the strength to pull an injured child to safety. "I'll go," Clara said quietly. "Absolutely not," Samuel snapped. "This is men's work. I'm small enough to fit, and I'm stronger than I look," Clara replied. "I've been hauling water and supplies for years." Before anyone could argue further, Nalnish stepped forward. He'd been examining the shaft opening, running his hands along the rocky edges with the practiced eye of someone who understood stone and earth. "Shaft not stable," he said in his careful English. "Need 2 people. 1 to go down, 1 to hold rope above. Need someone who knows rock." Samuel bristled. "We don't need advice from—" "Yes, we do," Mrs. Henderson interrupted, her voice fierce with maternal desperation. "My boy is down there, and I don't care who helps as long as they can get him out." Nalnish looked at Clara, something passing between them that transcended the barriers of language and culture. "You trust me?" he asked. Clara nodded without hesitation. "I trust you." What followed was the most dangerous hour of Clara's life. With Nalnish managing the rope system from above, she descended into the narrow shaft, her heart pounding as loose stones rattled past her in the darkness. The Apache words she'd been learning came to her unbidden, words for courage, for careful movement, for the darkness that enfolds without destroying. Tommy Henderson was wedged on a narrow ledge about 30 feet down, his leg bent at an unnatural angle. He was conscious, but frightened, tears streaming down his dirt-stained face. "Hey there, Tommy," Clara said softly, keeping her voice calm, despite the fear coursing through her veins. "I'm going to get you out of here." "Miss Clara, how'd you get down here?" "A friend helped me," Clara said, beginning the delicate process of securing the boy with rope. "A very good friend." As she worked, Clara found herself speaking softly in Apache, not because Tommy would understand, but because the words seemed to have a calming effect on both of them. The Apache language had words for protection, for safe passage, for the strength that comes from community working together. Above them, Nalnish's voice provided steady guidance, his instructions clear and precise. He'd switched between English and Apache, and Clara realized that she was understanding both languages, that the months of learning had given her an intuitive grasp of his meaning, even when the words were unfamiliar. "Haguni," she called up to him, the Apache word for careful, as she prepared to lift Tommy. "Haguni," came his response, and Clara felt the rope system adjust perfectly to support their combined weight. The ascent was treacherous. Tommy, despite his pain, followed Clara's instructions exactly, clinging to her with the trust that children give to adults who promise to keep them safe. Nalnish's rope work was flawless, adjusting for every shift in weight, every dangerous moment when loose rock threatened to send them tumbling back into the darkness. When they finally emerged into the fading daylight, the crowd erupted in cheers. Mrs. Henderson fell to her knees beside her son, tears of relief streaming down her face as she checked his injuries. "Thank you," she whispered to Clara. "Thank you so much." But Clara was looking at Nalnish, who was coiling the rope with the methodical precision of someone who had saved lives before. Their eyes met, and something passed between them that was deeper than gratitude. It was recognition, respect, and the beginning of genuine friendship. "Your Apache friend," Mrs. Henderson said, following Clara's gaze. He saved my boy too." Samuel Hutchins, who had watched the entire rescue in silence, stepped forward. His face was troubled, the certainty of his earlier anger replaced by something more complex. He began, then stopped. For a moment, Clara thought he might actually thank Nalnish, might acknowledge that the savage had risked his own safety to save a white child. Instead, he turned away, his jaw set in stubborn refusal to admit he'd been wrong. But Mrs. Henderson had no such reservations. She walked over to Nalnish and, despite the cultural barriers that had been drilled into her for decades, extended her hand. "Thank you," she said simply. "Thank you for helping save my son." Nalnish took her hand gravely. "Child in danger," he said. "All help." As the crowd began to disperse, carrying Tommy to the doctor's office, Clara found herself walking beside Nalnish in the gathering darkness. The confrontation that had begun the day seemed like something from another lifetime, though she knew it was far from over. "Today," Nalnish said quietly, You speak Apache with more than words. Clara looked at him, not understanding at first. You speak with actions, he explained. With heart, same as language. As they reached the edge of town, Clara realized that she had indeed been speaking Apache all day, not just with her carefully practiced words, but with her willingness to risk herself for others, her refusal to let prejudice stand in the way of doing what was right. The real test, she knew, would come tomorrow, when the immediate crisis had passed and the town had time to think about what had happened. But tonight, she had spoken a language that transcended words, and she had been understood. The heart's true language. Spring had returned to Willow Creek, bringing with it a sense of renewal that seemed to touch everything except the stubborn prejudices that divided the town. 3 months had passed since the mine shaft rescue, and the event had left subtle but permanent changes in its wake. Tommy Henderson's leg had healed well, and he'd taken to greeting Clara with shy smiles and the occasional gauge cue that made her heart sing. Mrs. Henderson had become an unexpected ally, quietly defending Clara when the gossip grew too vicious. "She saved my boy," she would say firmly, ending conversations that might otherwise have turned cruel. But not everyone was ready to let go of their old beliefs, and Samuel Hutchins had doubled down on his opposition, calling Clara's actions during the rescue a dangerous precedent. The real change, however, was in Clara herself. The months of learning Apache had transformed her in ways she was only beginning to understand. She no longer saw the language as a collection of foreign words to be memorized, but as a window into a completely different way of understanding the world. Each conversation with Nalnish revealed new layers of meaning, new ways of thinking about community, respect, and the interconnectedness of all things. On this particular Thursday, Clara arrived at the trading post to find Nalnish in deep conversation with 2 other Apache men. Their voices carried the musical quality she'd learned to love, rising and falling in patterns that seemed to echo the natural rhythms of wind and water. As she approached, she caught fragments of their conversation and realized they were discussing something serious. The word bilagana, the Apache term for white people, came up repeatedly, along with words she associated with conflict and concern. "Gojk," Clara said softly, not wanting to interrupt but hoping to understand. Nalnish looked up, his expression troubled. "Gojk, Clara, we speak of difficult things. May I ask what kind of difficult things?" The 2 other Apache men studied Clara with curious eyes. She recognized one as Nalnish's cousin, a younger man named Goyawe, who had been skeptical of her learning efforts. The other was older, his face lined with the wisdom and wariness of someone who had seen too much conflict. "There is talk," Nalnish said carefully, "of soldiers coming. Your government sends men to move my people to reservation land far from here." Clara felt her heart sink. She'd heard rumors of such policies, but they'd seemed distant, theoretical. The reality of forced relocation suddenly became vivid and heartbreaking. "When?" she asked. "Soon, perhaps. My cousin says the Blue Coats gather in Fort Apache." Nalnish's voice carried a weight of resignation that made Clara's chest tighten. The older Apache man spoke rapidly in their language, his tone urgent. Clara caught only fragments, but she understood enough to know he was questioning why Nalnish was sharing such information with a white woman. Nalnish replied calmly, and Clara heard him use a phrase that made her breath catch. "Di hastin dinebizad baan tekisko yenisha." She speaks our language with a learning heart. The older man's expression softened slightly, and he looked at Clara with new attention. "You understand our words?" he asked in heavily accented English. "Some," Clara admitted. "Not enough, but I'm trying to learn." What followed was the most important conversation of Clara's life. The 3 Apache men began to share their perspective on the approaching crisis, speaking in a mixture of English and Apache that required Clara to use every skill she'd developed over the past months. They talked about the sacred places they would lose, the way of life that would be destroyed, the children who would grow up disconnected from their homeland. "Your people," the older man said, his voice heavy with sorrow. "They see only empty land. They do not understand that land has spirit, has memory. They think if they move us far away, we will forget who we are." Clara felt tears stinging her eyes. "Not all of us think that way," she said quietly. "No," Nalnish agreed, "but not enough think different way." As the conversation continued, Clara realized that something unprecedented was happening. These Apache men were trusting her with their fears, their plans, their hopes for the future. They were speaking to her not as a white woman who had learned some of their words, but as someone who had earned the right to understand their hearts. The older man, whose name was Chichin, suddenly asked her a question that cut to the core of everything. "Why do you learn our words, Bilagana woman? What do you hope to find?" Clara thought carefully before answering. "I was looking for understanding," she said. "I thought if I could learn your language, I could understand your people better, but I learned something else instead." "What did you learn?" I learned that understanding isn't about knowing someone else's words, it's about being willing to see the world through their eyes, to feel their pain and their joy as if it were your own. Clara paused, searching for the right words. I learned that the most important language isn't spoken with the mouth but with the heart. Chechen nodded slowly. You speak truth. But what will you do with this heart language? It was a question Clara had been asking herself for weeks. Now suddenly, she knew the answer. I'll use it to build bridges, she said, between your people and mine, between fear and understanding, between war and peace. The three Apache men exchanged looks, and Clara saw something pass between them, a decision being made, a trust being extended. There will be a meeting, Nalnish said quietly, between my people and yours, to talk about the reservation, about what comes next. Will you come, to listen with your heart, to speak words that might help? Clara felt the weight of the moment settling on her shoulders. She understood that this was more than an invitation. It was a request for her to put her learning to the test, to step fully into the role of translator not just of words, but of worlds. Yes, she said without hesitation. I'll come. As the three Apache men prepared to leave, Chechen placed a gentle hand on Clara's shoulder. Nalnish was right about you, he said. You speak with your heart. That is the language that matters most. After they left, Clara stood alone in the fading light, understanding that her journey with the Apache language had brought her to this moment, not just to learn words, but to become a bridge between two worlds that desperately needed to understand each other. The mockery she'd endured, the loneliness, the months of struggle with unfamiliar sounds and concepts, it had all led to this. She was no longer just a white woman learning Apache words. She had become something new, something necessary, a translator of hearts, a speaker of the language that could heal the divisions that kept people apart. Tomorrow she would find out if the language of the heart was strong enough to overcome the language of fear. But tonight, she felt a peace she'd never known before, the peace of someone who had found her true purpose in the world. The story of Clara and the Apache words was far from over. It was just beginning. The end.